paradrama tales. She told me she wanted children. I believed her. She told me there were no past flames still in her life. I believed that too. Years later, I learned both were lies. Now I lie awake asking myself one question: what part of my marriage was ever real? I remember the moment she told me like I remember a cold room, clear, still, and uninviting. We had been married a little over a year. Things felt steady, not perfect but settled. The chaos of wedding planning had passed. The rhythms of life together had started to hum. Groceries on Sundays, Netflix on Tuesdays, shared laundry folded unevenly but lovingly. And then, one night, it came out. Not in anger, not in drama. Just a quiet confession over a glass of wine we hadn't meant to finish. "I never really wanted kids," she said. I looked at her, confused, waiting for the punchline. But there wasn't one. Just the stillness of her gaze and the way she refused to look away. At first, I laughed, softly. "What do you mean? You told me from the beginning. You said it was important to you too." "I know," she said. "I didn't want to lose you." I just sat there still holding my glass, and in that moment, I felt something strange. Not anger, not even betrayal, just empty. Because how do you respond to that? I had made my truth clear from the start. I told her, delicately but firmly, that I wanted a family. That being a father wasn't just a desire, it was something core to the man I saw myself becoming. And she had looked me in the eye and told me she wanted the same. But now, she was telling me that those words were never hers. They were mine, mirrored back to me out of fear, a performance for the sake of staying loved. And the worst part? I understood it. I understood why she did it. Who hasn't said something softer than they meant just to hold on to a good thing? Who hasn't bent a little in the early days hoping they'd grow into the shape they promised? But this wasn't bending. This was breaking something I hadn't even known was at risk. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just stared at the wall behind her and whispered, "You lied." She cried, said she was confused back then, that maybe a part of her hoped she'd change, that she thought I'd leave if she told the truth, and that she loved me too much to risk that. And in a twisted way, that made it worse, because now the lie wasn't selfish, it was romantic. And romantic lies are harder to pull out by the root. They wrap themselves around everything else and convince you they're kindness. They say, "I did it for us," when really they did it for survival. I stayed. I wish I could tell you I walked away right then with dignity and self-worth and a clear moral boundary. But I didn't. I told myself the world was hard enough. Maybe it was wiser, safer, not to bring a child into it. Maybe we could build something else. Travel more, love harder, find meaning in freedom. But even as I said those words to myself, I knew something had shifted. Not just between us, but inside me. It wasn't about children anymore. It was about trust. And once it breaks, you don't always hear the snap. Sometimes it just goes quiet. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that first lie. Not the one about her ex. That came later. Not the omissions, not the half-truths. Just that very first one. The lie that wrapped itself in love and said, "Yes, I want kids too." Because the longer I sit with it, the more I realize it wasn't about babies. It was about choice. And the choice she made wasn't just to lie. It was to shape the foundation of our life together around something she didn't believe in. Something she didn't even want. I try to understand it. I do. We all want to be loved. We all want to be chosen. And in the early days, when someone comes to you with something clear and firm, like I did with wanting a family, it's tempting to say yes. Even if part of you means no. Maybe she thought she'd change, or maybe she thought I would. That love would sand down our sharp edges, make one of us compromise in time, that something so big could eventually become small. But here's what people forget. Big lies don't shrink. They sit. They settle. They make space for themselves in the silent corners of your marriage, between shared bedsheets, inside long road trips, beneath polite smiles at dinner parties. And one day, when the topic comes back around, the future, the family, the what comes next, they rise again, unchanged, still sharp, still waiting to be acknowledged. When she told me the truth, finally, quietly, it didn't sound cruel. It sounded tired, like she'd been carrying a secret that had grown heavier than love itself. And maybe, in her mind, finally telling me was an act of bravery. But to me, it felt like a rewrite, a bait and switch, a decision made for both of us, long before I ever had the full story. What hurt most wasn't that she didn't want children. It was that she took away my right to choose whether I wanted a life with someone who didn't. She decided for me. And she did it while looking me in the eye, holding my hand, and promising the future I'd built my hopes on. That's the thing about foundational lies. They don't just make you question the moment they're revealed, they make you question everything that followed. The apartment we chose because it was close to good schools. The way she smiled at babies in the park, and I thought, she'll be a great mom. The conversations we had about names, traditions, bedtime songs, all of it, recolored, tainted, still real, but suddenly empty. And then you wonder, was she ever really with me? Or was she playing along, hoping the charade would feel more natural with time? There's a reason this lie came first. Because it taught her she could bend the truth and still be loved. That I would adjust. That I would hold the weight of what she couldn't say out loud. And once that dynamic was in place, me compromising, her avoiding, it became our rhythm. It set the tone for everything that came after. So no, the baby conversation wasn't just about a baby. It was the blueprint. And I didn't see it. Not because I was blind, but because I wanted so badly for what we had to be real. Even if it was only half true. I didn't go looking for it. That's the part I keep circling back to. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't suspicious. Not in the way people usually mean when they say that. I wasn't digging through drawers or scrolling through old messages with a clenched jaw and a broken heart. I was just charging her phone. It lit up. A message preview. A name I didn't recognize. Not one of her co-workers or friends. Just a first name. Simple. Unremarkable. But the words stuck. Good morning. Thinking of you. It wasn't romantic. Not on the surface. But it wasn't neutral either. And something in me, some quiet, persistent instinct said, check the thread. I hesitated. I wish I could say I didn't. But I did. I opened it. And within 30 seconds, I knew I was looking at something I was never meant to see. Not because it was private, but because it was proof. Proof that I wasn't the only one she shared her mornings with. Proof that there was a history she hadn't just kept from me, but protected from me. Tucked away, carefully maintained. They'd been texting for years. Good mornings, good nights, song lyrics, personal updates. Just thinking of you on birthdays. Little check-ins, familiar jokes, photos, nostalgia. And it wasn't just now, it had started long before we married, spanned into our engagement, continued through our vows. Quiet, steady, like a second heartbeat I never noticed. And there it was, another life running parallel to mine. Not physical, as far as I could tell, not overtly sexual, but emotional, deeply, intimately, reassuringly constant. She confided in him, sometimes the same things she confided in me, sometimes more. And the worst part? She had lied when I asked. Twice. Before we got married, I asked directly, is there anyone from your past still in your life? Anyone I should know about? She said no. I asked again later, once, in a moment of reflection. She laughed and said, no old flames, promise. But this was an old flame, maybe not burning, but warm, alive, federal. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She didn't scramble for an excuse. She just said, I knew you'd be mad. And that's when I realized what I was really up against. It wasn't just the lie, it was the justification for the lie. She didn't think I'd yell. She knew I wouldn't scream. That's never been my way. What she feared wasn't my anger. It was my disappointment, my clarity, my questions she didn't want to answer. So instead, she chose silence. She maintained a relationship she knew would hurt me because it gave her something I didn't, or maybe because it reminded her of a version of herself that existed before us. I don't know. I only know this. When someone hides something this big, not once, not for a weekend, but for years, you start to doubt everything else. Not just the marriage, the mornings, the small smiles, the quiet I love yous. You wonder who else she was texting after kissing you goodnight. You wonder if you were ever the only person in the room. And most of all, you wonder how many truths she decided you didn't need to know. Those were her exact words. Not screamed, not sobbed, just said, flatly, like a conclusion drawn from years of mental rehearsal. I lied because I knew you'd be mad. She didn't flinch when she said it. She didn't look afraid. And maybe that's what made it land harder than anything else. There was no panic in her voice. No regret either. Just calculation. And I stood there looking at her, trying to decide what kind of man she thought I was. Because here's the thing. I don't yell. I don't throw things. I've never slammed a door in my life. If anything, I've always been the opposite. Too calm, maybe. I grew up watching people lose their tempers like clocks striking noon, and I swore I'd never let my emotions bulldoze someone else's peace. I'm the kind of person who listens first, who asks questions, who takes a breath before responding. So when she said she lied to avoid me being mad, I didn't hear fear. I heard avoidance. I heard I didn't want to have a hard conversation, so I chose the easy deception. And maybe that's what hurt the most, not the message threads, not the emotional intimacy she gave to someone else, but the fact that she believed my disappointment wasn't worth her discomfort. That's the deal she made. And I wasn't even in the room when it was made. She decided I couldn't be trusted with the truth, because the truth would complicate the comfort we'd built, because it would invite questions she didn't want to answer, because it would force her to take responsibility not just for one choice, but for the long line of choices that followed it. And I think, in her mind, that lie was protective. It kept things smooth. It kept the peace. It kept the version of herself she wanted to be. The faithful wife, the honest partner, intact. As long as I didn't know, she could keep pretending. But lies like that don't protect love. They delay its collapse. They let rot form in the walls while the outside still looks beautiful. When she finally told me the truth, not because she wanted to, but because I found it, I asked her, "Did you ever think about telling me?" She paused, and then she said, "I thought about it every day." That almost broke me, because every good morning she sent him was one she didn't tell me about. Every kiss she gave me goodnight was sealed with the hope that I never asked too many questions. Every month, every year, she had the chance to come clean, and chose not to. Not because she feared my anger, but because she feared my clarity. She knew what I'd do with the truth. I'd stand in it, and then I'd make a decision. So instead, she gave me lies dressed as mercy. Lies meant to spare me pain, but that only multiplied it in the end. And the irony is, I wasn't mad. Not in the way she expected. I was grieving, not the messages, but the quiet, lifelong pattern she revealed in 5 words. I lied because I knew. There's a strange kind of grief that comes not from losing something, but from realizing it might never have existed the way you thought it did. That's where I found myself, sitting in my own house, across from the woman I loved, and wondering, how much of this was ever real? Not the marriage license, not the photos, not the routine. No, those things were real enough, tangible, shared. The morning coffees, the late-night grocery runs, the silent car rides home after long dinners with friends. We lived them together. But what about the truth that was supposed to sit underneath it all? the truth about who we were, what we wanted, what we trusted each other with. That's what had cracked. And once you see a crack in the foundation, you start hearing every creak in the floor differently. You start questioning the walls you leaned against for years. You walk through the same rooms, but they feel off, tilted, fragile. I began replaying everything in my head. Our early dates, where she smiled and said she wanted a big family someday. The night we stayed up talking about baby names, when she laughed at one I loved, and I thought it was because she was imagining it too. Even our wedding vows. I promise to be honest, even when it's hard. That line echoes in me now, like a cruel echo, a haunting line from a play she never meant to follow. But this wasn't just about two lies. It was about a pattern of comfort over courage, saying what sounded good instead of what was true. And for the longest time, I didn't see it, not because I was blind, but because I believed. I wanted this marriage to work. I wanted it to be real so badly. I filled in the blanks myself. I assumed honesty. I assumed alignment. I assumed we were on the same page just because we were holding the same book. But you can sit next to someone for years and still be reading two different stories. And now, mine felt foreign. Now, every memory felt tainted, not ruined, but revised. And I couldn't trust the narrator anymore, not even my own version of me, because suddenly, I wasn't sure if I had been loving her or loving the idea of her I was handed. So I started asking quieter questions, not to her, to myself. Can I live with this? Do I want to try? Is love still love when you learn it started in disguise? There's no handbook for what to do when the person you built your life with turns out to have been wearing masks you never saw. But I do know this. Love can survive many things. Silence, distance, disagreement. But love cannot survive a cracked foundation that no one is willing to rebuild from the ground up. And at that moment, staring at the woman who said she lied to keep me, all I could feel was the weight of the house we built, shifting beneath me. You always imagine betrayal as loud, raised voices, accusations, a slammed door, someone walking out in tears, something dramatic that splits the timeline of your life into before and after. But mine wasn't like that. Ours didn't come with shouting. It didn't even come with anger. Not really. It came with silence, a long, hollow kind of silence that sat between us like a third presence in the room, familiar, permanent, uninvited. After the truth came out, we kept living together. We shared meals, took turns doing laundry, answered texts from friends, watered the plants. On the surface, life moved on, but underneath, something had stopped. She would look at me sometimes, like she wanted to say something, like she almost would. But then she'd glance down, or away, or back at the TV, and the moment would pass. I stopped asking her what she was thinking. I stopped trying to close the gap. Because what do you say when the hurt isn't fresh anymore? Just constant? Some nights we lay side by side in bed, the distance between our bodies a kind of unspoken agreement. I could hear her breathing, steady, normal, and mine, just slightly faster. Like my chest knew what my mind was trying not to feel, that something between us had died, and we were both pretending not to smell the smoke. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't hit you all at once. It seeps, slowly, quietly. It moves through your routines. It laces your conversations. It turns good morning into a scan for meaning. It turns I love you into a question you don't want answered. And the worst part? It teaches you to lie to yourself, to get through dinner, to get through Tuesday, to not fall apart in the middle of folding towels. You tell yourself things like, it wasn't that bad. People survive worse. Maybe she meant well. Maybe I can get over it. And maybe that's true. But betrayal doesn't always need volume to leave a scar. Sometimes it just needs repetition. Years of knowing, Years of choosing not to tell you. Years of building something with you while secretly holding a door open for someone else. She didn't break me with rage. She wore me down with quiet. And I wonder if that's why it hurt so much, because I couldn't even hate her. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't calculating in the traditional sense. She was just absent, in the moments that required presence, in the conversations that required courage, in the honesty that required risk. And I loved her anyway. Maybe that was the real betrayal, that I gave her all my trust, not perfectly, not without fault, but fully. And in return, she gave me comfort dressed as connection. So we sat in that silence for weeks. No big arguments, no final straw. Just two people in the same house, holding hands across a fault line, pretending not to feel the ground shifting. I used to think there were only two choices in a broken relationship: fix it or leave. Like it was that simple. Like there was some switch inside you labeled rebuild or run, and once you made the call, everything else just fell into place. But when you're sitting inside something that once felt like home, now echoing with unspoken questions, that choice doesn't feel binary. It feels impossible. I thought about therapy. We talked about it, briefly, carefully, like two diplomats negotiating a ceasefire neither side fully believed in. She said she was open to it. I said I'd go. But the truth was, I didn't know if I wanted to fix what we had, or just understand how it broke. Because rebuilding sounds noble, romantic even. Two people in pain, choosing to stay, fighting for what they once had. The world loves a redemption arc. But here's the thing, no one says out loud. Not everything broken should be rebuilt. Some things weren't built right to begin with. And that's what I kept coming back to. Not the betrayal itself, but what it revealed. A pattern, a foundation that was never solid, agreements that weren't mutual, just assumed, truths that were half told or delayed until they were convenient. Could we repair that? Maybe. Would I ever trust it again? I wasn't sure. Because rebuilding requires more than saying, I'm sorry. It requires excavation, unlearning, a kind of vulnerability that doesn't flinch under pressure. And most of all, it requires two people who are ready to be known completely, not just loved conveniently. And part of me doubted whether she could do that. More painfully, part of me doubted whether I could. Could I look at her every morning and not see the timeline she kept hidden? Could I hear her laugh and not wonder who else she once laughed like that with, while I was making plans she never truly shared? Could I lay next to her and trust that her silence meant peace, not retreat? That's what betrayal does. It doesn't just wound. It warps. And so I sat with the question longer than I should have. Do I stay and rebuild, or do I walk away before I disappear inside this silence for good? There was no clear answer. Only more silence. Some mornings I would reach for her hand and hold it, not out of certainty, but out of memory. Other days, I'd wake up before her and stare at the ceiling thinking, if I left today, would she fight for me, or let me go with the same softness she told the lies? What I realized, slowly, painfully, is that staying isn't always the brave choice, and leaving isn't always the selfish one. Sometimes staying is fear, and sometimes walking away is the first honest thing you've done in a long time. I used to think love was about staying, that if you really loved someone, you stuck around, you fought, you forgave, you found a way to make it work, even when it didn't feel like it was working. That's what strength looked like to me. That's what commitment meant. But now, I'm not so sure, because I stayed. I stayed through the lies. I stayed through the silence. I stayed when the foundation cracked and the walls began to whisper doubts into my sleep. And still, somehow love felt farther away than ever. It turns out, love doesn't always live in the staying. Sometimes, love lives in the asking. The hard questions, the honest ones, like, why did you lie? Like, do you actually want this life, or just fear starting over? Like, can I trust you not because you say the right thing, but because you're willing to say the hard thing? And most important, can we love each other without pretending? Because love, real love, demands more than presence. It demands transparency. It demands that when you're afraid, you speak it. That when something doesn't feel right, you don't hide it under routine. That when you're tempted to lie for comfort, you choose discomfort for the sake of honesty instead. Love demands the kind of courage that isn't always poetic. Sometimes it's quiet and awkward. It stumbles. It says, "I'm scared you'll leave, but I'd rather lose you with the truth than keep you with a lie." That's not what we had. What we had was polite. It was soft. It was easy to photograph. But underneath, it was padded with things unsaid, things postponed, things deliberately softened so neither of us had to sit in the full truth of what we were building or what we were avoiding. I kept thinking, if she just apologizes, if we just go to therapy, if we just recommit. But love isn't a list of conditions to check off. It's a living thing, and ours had stopped breathing. Maybe it wasn't her fault alone. Maybe I made it easy to lie by being so understanding, so measured, so afraid of being the guy who overreacts. Maybe I created a space where honesty didn't feel necessary, because I never made truth a requirement, just an assumption. But assumptions can't carry weight forever. Love, real love, demands weight-bearing truth. It says, "I see you fully. I let you see me. And if what we see breaks us, at least we broke honestly." I never got that from her. And to be honest, I'm not sure she ever got that from me. So maybe the question now isn't, do I still love her? Maybe it's, do I love myself enough to stop settling for half-truths dressed as peace? Because love doesn't ask you to disappear inside of someone else's comfort. It asks you to stand, clear-eyed, in front of another human being and say, "This is all of me. Are you sure you want to stay?" And if the answer is yes, then you build. But if the answer is silence, you leave. Not in anger, but in truth. I didn't leave with a suitcase in the rain. There was no dramatic goodbye, no shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet morning. I made coffee. She was still asleep. I looked around the house we built together and realized I wasn't angry. I was done. Done waiting for the version of her that would look me in the eye and say, "I'm ready to tell the truth, even if it costs me comfort." Done shrinking myself to keep the peace. Done trying to repair something we never truly built on honest ground. And I wasn't leaving because I stopped loving her. I was leaving because I finally started loving myself enough not to stay where truth had no room to breathe. We talk so much about love, as loyalty, as sacrifice, as holding on. But maybe love, at its deepest level, is the willingness to stand in the truth, no matter how lonely, no matter how quiet, no matter how inconvenient it makes the life you've built. Because truth isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of whatever comes next. And if you've ever found yourself asking, was any of this real? If you've ever sat in a silence so thick it felt like betrayal, if you've ever chosen to stay, and then chosen, bravely, finally, to leave, you're not broken. You're becoming honest. And that's where healing starts. If this story sat with you, even uncomfortably, stick around, because we tell more than stories here. We tell the truths most people are too afraid to say out loud. Subscribe, watch another, or just take a breath. You don't have to lie to be loved, and you don't have to stay to be whole.